Hi, I'm Katie Tyler, and I'm here with John Dawson of ExactData. ExactData specializes in the creation of synthetic data for testing and optimizing data processing systems. John, welcome.
Hi, Katie.
Thanks for being with us here today. I wanted to start with a quick definition of synthetic data for those who don't know what synthetic data is.
Sure. It's most test data is Katie's actually derived from production data sources using ETL technologies, extract, transform, load, Informatica, IBM Optum, Mathematica. There's a new class of test data, synthetic test data being generated today using what's called high fidelity synthetic data generation. So it's not derived from a data source. It's actually generated from scratch seed data using algorithms, or basically rules engines, sophisticated rules engines.
Can you clarify that last piece talk a little bit about the algorithms that you use at ExactData and why that's a really good idea versus perhaps trying to replicate real life data?
Sure, it's basically the rules are like think of a layer on a cake, if you will. Is that you'll define a model universe and you basically say what you want the data to look like at the end of the day. And the rules go through an iterative process, hitting different layers of the cake, if you will, until it meets all the constraints you've defined. And the big advantage of that is that you can generate data that meets exactly what you want. So it not only mirrors your production data, but it also has the use cases designed into the data. So if the software algorithms have specific requirements, it's actually baked into the data model. And so those use cases are actually in the data, both a positive and negative, true and false positives, true and false negatives, but also the system response files. And then you're also generating a lot of metadata about the data. So it's instead of taking production data and then modifying it where you really don't know what you're starting with, and it's very difficult to modify it, you're using a computer basically to generate exactly what you want. So those are kind of the fundamental differences.
That's really interesting. You mentioned use cases. What are some of the use cases that you're seeing lately in your work? Are there new things that are emerging or patterns within your customers or your prospective customers that are bubbling up to the top more than others?
Sure. I was on a call yesterday where it was the use case was insider threats for Formula One race car drivers. Race car drivers leaving one team, going to another team, and of course, their intellectual property around racing is extremely valuable. And it was a behavioral analytics they were running to try to find, and in this use case, they actually were able to find that the race car driver was downloading and stealing the intellectual property. So in that use case, it's the actual behavior that somebody would exhibit when they're A, about to leave a company, and then B, that they're actually stealing the intellectual property. So that's one recent example.
Wow, that's really interesting because in cybersecurity, we think about insider threat all the time, but you don't think about Formula One as being sort of this inside job, but obviously it makes sense because all kinds of companies have intellectual property, they have their secrets, they have their formulas for winning or beating the competition. That's an interesting use case. Let's talk about cybersecurity a little bit because most of Tag Cyber's audience is made up of practitioners. So when it comes to companies that are end user companies that are testing security vendor products, synthetic data could offer a lot of benefits. Are there, you just mentioned insider threat, but are there other things, other types of use cases that you think either are working really well or contexts where synthetic data could be applied more and benefit those enterprises even better than real data, production data?
Sure, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So on the buyer side, let's just use an example. Another example or use case would be sexual harassment. Is that you want to monitor your network for sexual harassment, and that's where this harassment is a pattern that evolves over time, and it has complex behaviors in that. And to actually test for that, if you're going to buy a solution like that and make sure that they're catching these behaviors, you're going to want to be able to test for that. And that's where a technology like this would come into play, is that we would be able to create those dynamic, complex payloads that exhibited the things that you're trying to find. And actually, when a company comes in and implements these systems, you can actually make sure it's catching the stuff it's supposed to. And to our knowledge, there's really no way of doing this effectively unless you're using a technology like this, where you have a defined test object that you know what the system results would be that you could actually run through the system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems to me like there could be a lot of good use cases like that within data, but where you may not want to use your real live data. One case that comes to mind for me is when security vendors, security product makers use live data for testing or POCs where they have, a big company or retailer or a financial services company or a manufacturer testing their product. Actually getting that proof of concept set up for the prospective customer using production data, it could be problematic in a lot of ways. How is using synthetic data either better or less risky than data masking, for instance?
Sure. Again, a great question. We get asked this a lot. In fact, we were just talking to a major vendor, and they said, "Hey, why would we use you guys? Why would we use fake data when I have unlimited amounts of production data I can use?" Which is a very, very typical question for us. So just to use an example, and I'll go back to the sexual harassment example, is that if, of course, the company probably has data regarding previous or past sexual harassment cases. And so, and that's a valid use case, is to actually use that previous data and run it through the system and see if it caught that sexual harassment. It actually detected that behavior. But there's a couple big problems with that. Number one, well, it's private and confidential. You have to deal with those issues. But aside from that, you actually have to go in and find that data. And then you have to make sure the data is exhibiting the correct properties that you want for those specific use cases. And then it's highly unlikely that you'll have data already that exhibits all of the types of sexual harassment that you want. So you have the added problem of use case coverage, is that it's very likely that in your production data you have a very low use case coverage. In fact, we typically find it's in the 5 to 10% range. So there's just some very fundamental inherent problems with going about that from a buyer perspective.
I would also think for the customer testing the vendor product, it would save them time, it would decrease their risk of a data leak or a data breach, it would reduce their regulatory risk, if somehow some of the data were exposed in some way, and it would just be easier for the vendor to implement a proof of concept if they don't have to go in and mask all the data or de-anonymize the data. They could use data that's very, very lifelike, but not realistic. Or not real, rather. It's realistic, but not real.
Yeah, absolutely. We did a project, we worked with the IRS with Northrop Grumman, and before we came on board, the time for them to create the data that they needed from the production data was months. They had to get a security waiver, was the first step. And processing and security layer took a month to 6 weeks. And then they had to extract the data that they needed, find the data they needed, extract the data, and then modify the data for the use cases that they needed. And it was crazy. A typical time from need to having the data was in that 2 to 3 month range. And it was just crazy. And they adopted a technology like this, and we were generating the data they needed in hours and days. So it's definitely transformational type technology from using production data. It's hard for people to get their heads around it because they're just so used to using production data, but there are alternatives out there.
Wow, yeah, and the time spent on both the prospective customer testing the product and the vendor's time to start up the POC, because obviously the point of a proof of concept or a demo is to show the end user what the product can do. And if there are delays on both ends, that's time, it's money, it's resources, it's a lot of stuff, which both security teams and end user teams don't have in abundance these days.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it even goes from there, like training the SOC and deploying it. Again, you need a very large use case coverage and where you're going to get that data and does it exist in the production data sources. So it really goes out from the entire life cycle through the procurement, through the deployment, training, and then ongoing monitoring of that solution.
Yeah, that seems like a no-brainer for me. What am I missing? I can't see any barriers for adoption of using synthetic data, either from the end user, again, the retailer or the healthcare company or the financial services company, or from a vendor point of view. Why wouldn't a company use synthetic data for these purposes?
Yeah, again, it's a great question. From our perspective, it's almost always been just lack of awareness. We talked to a major CISO last week. It was lack of awareness that there's technology alternatives. Generally, there's just a lack of awareness that because the use of production data is so ingrained in this technology space, in the global technology space, not only for cybersecurity, but for all applications. And there's a $10 billion industry around using production data through ETL technologies, which is a huge, massive industry. There's just not, from our perspective, when we talk to people, there's just a lack of awareness. So once they find out the alternatives, then generally they're interested in exploring them. And in fact, some companies are actually investing in developing these technologies, and they're just not aware that there's commercial, technologies out there. So that's what we just found historically to be the big roadblock, just lack of awareness.
That makes sense. So aside from awareness, are there any other hesitations when you explain what synthetic data is, how it can be used, and share some of the risk reduction, the time benefits? Are there any other things that come up in your conversations?
Yeah, again, a great question. It very typically is, how do I know the synthetic data is going to mirror my production system, right? So is it really representative or not? That's very common and a very legitimate question. And then, we explain our process and how we go through that. And we actually, make sure it meets it, and we have ways of validating the data, so we can walk through that. But again, it's a legitimate question, and the synthetic data doesn't mirror the production data 100%. It's not by design. It's not to. It's actually designed for a system under test. So it's just a very different use case. And we do know, though, with synthetic data is that the data we're generating meets that particular need. And that's the thing you don't know when you use production data, because it doesn't have all the characteristics you need. So that's very, very common. Another very, very common thing is that clients think that they can use synthetic data for policy decisions. So as an example, to actually determine which malware they should be trying to detect, as an example. And that's not a good use case. In fact, it's opposite from what we do. We actually are what they want to test for malware, and then we're designing it into the data. So that's a common point of confusion also. We don't advocate not using production data. Fortinet collects, I think, 200K new malwares every day that they publish, and they write into their malware detection systems, FortiTester, and that's absolutely the right thing to do. You want to continue to do that, and that's extremely, and it's very valid at the IRS and all the clients. But where I think the gap is that they're not testing systems they're deploying adequately for the use cases that they believe these systems are supposed to be detecting. And the behavioral use cases are classics because they just don't have that data. They don't know if the behaviors are in the data, nor are they designing all the use cases into the data they're using for testing. So that's an example where you have a system under test. You want to make sure that you're testing it appropriately for the known requirements that you have. So the known malware, known requirements, and that's where you want to use synthetic data. That's where it's much better alternative.
So it sounds like for companies who are a little hesitant or unsure, they could actually use a combination in some cases to dip their toe in the water, get that level of comfort, and see what synthetic data is and how it works in test environments.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, for being here with us today and for talking about what you do at ExactData. I hope this was useful for those of you listening and watching. And thanks.
All right. Thanks, Katie.
Bye.